So we had one question early on from a grower that, in his opinion, his site is very, very uniform. Yet he can lose 10 to 15% of the trees when he plants them. So I picked up a little bit at the end of the presentation that you and Consuelo put together that maybe it was the depth the tree was planted or something like this. But what would be some of the other things that you would suspect if, again, the situation is uniform, the grower is experienced, but they're still losing 10 to 15% of the trees? What kinds of things would you look for?
Yeah, I think so again, spending a lot of time planting our own trees. In that scenario, we usually say if we lose more than 1%, in transplanting, we know there's a problem. So then if you want to start determining what that problem is, I would say if you are happy that it's good clonal trees, tree consistency is uniform, root inspection shows you it's good clonal roots, then I'm going to default first towards probably irrigation, planting depth, try and find that variation that's induced. So I think most frequently you might have planters going through, and often it's the same. If you have 2 or 3 guys planting, the same guy will repeat his fault. So you'll find some rhythm to it. It's 10 trees, and somewhere down the orchard you have another 10, and then so that's typically something that is a person creating a fault because there's a repetition to the mistake. If it's more haphazard, then often I would default more towards irrigation. Now, I mean, that could be as simple as, either over or under scheduling, or just, the irrigation. Let's say if you use microjets, it might just be in the wrong position, fell over, maybe it's blocked. So that would be sort of the first thing. If none of those things, we've seen funny things, termite infestations, that creates a lot of air, in the root system. It basically air prunes the roots. That's something to look out for, specifically in South Africa. If you've really gone through all of that, planting depth is correct, then I would probably dig up trees and just try and determine, things like, is it good clonal roots, as the seed severed, what happened in that rooting environment, what went wrong. But I would really say to guys, 90% of the time it would be something like that. Sometimes in South Africa, people will spray herbicides. That's also more human, you'll find the repetition to it. Some people do believe if they put a little container, next or over the trunk, it doesn't burn, but it's still, yeah, avocados are very sensitive. So we would typically wait until, everything's dried out and brown before we start spraying the herbicides.
Thanks. Another question was, I know that Consuelo left, but I was curious about what kind of fertilizer program do you have in the nursery, at least at Alice Vista?
Yeah, I think so we try and focus a lot on controlled release fertilizers. Again, you want to cut out as much variability as you can. So that works very well for us, but we do top up fertilizer, drenches if we need to. But it's often more, towards balancing ECs and monitoring ECs really well, balancing tree condition. But in essence, we believe really well in controlled release fertilizers. Also, in my opinion, a good habit if people don't fertigate. Instead of doing top dressings, that's also something that human error kicks in. Whereas controlled fertilizers, there's a 6 to 8 month, application. And what we've seen with that is very uniform growth, from the tree. So you don't have a growth phase, stop growth phase, sort of that type of growth development. The controlled release fertilizer gets you a very consistent growth, and a lot of them also include micronutrients that people tend to not apply to young trees. And I think what's important to understand from a good nursery perspective is we prime the tree to be perfect once you get it. And often growers, underestimate the amount of effort that goes into things like nutrient balances, micronutrients. So, typically when a tree goes into the orchard, it's primed for growth. And it's very important to keep that going and, stable, keep that as a stable nutrition growth going on. Don't cut back on fertilizer in those initial phases. It really gives you good growth and good production.
Great. There was a question earlier. I sort of answered it, but I get your perspective. So the question was about if you have clonals, you have less alternate bearing. So let me tell you how I answered it on the chat. Is that not all clonal rootstocks are what we want, and a good example of that is the G755, one of the very early quote improved rootstocks, which had high level of phytophthora tolerance, but was a horrible producer, and also had alternate bearing. But there's a lot of other factors that influence alternate bearing. But in theory, when we have done trials with rootstocks, that the variability from tree to tree within the rootstock, the different trees in the rootstock, is far less than when, at least in that initial trial where we had a seedling rootstock where it was extremely variable. So, but in your opinion, the alternate bearing, I mean, that is a big question everywhere about alternate bearing.
Yeah, I think my first answer would be put it on a trellis, but no, I won't do that. No, I think as short as possible. You ask me sort of a question that has a lot of answers, but I have a very true and honest opinion about alternate bearing, and I think people, like I said, they want to assign it to nutrition only, and I think it's not as simple as that. Or pruning, some people just want to look at, and I think it's important within that context, again, understand that we work with a lot of variables, and understanding genetics is really one very, very, very critical part of it. Now, in my opinion, in genetics, there's two factors that influence alternate bearing. Some varieties are more prone genetically towards alternate bearing. Some of it you can understand by just looking at growth habits. Something like Gem, one of our new varieties, some varieties are very well at producing on a specific shoot, 3 or 4 fruit, and shoot growth will continue and it'll have fruit developing again on the same shoot. And usually those type of late varieties perform really well and don't have extreme, alternate bearing. Something like Lamaz, what we often find is it doesn't produce on the same shoot, it produces on another shoot. And if you don't have good enough nutrition programs on a variety like that, you don't stimulate enough regenerative growth in the on-year. And I think it's important then, then nutrition and pruning becomes very important, because you constantly need to rejuvenate the tree fast enough that you have a consistent amount of volume producing fruit. Now, that's the one end of it, of genetics. The other side, I think is understanding energy balance. I think something that you touched on now. So, some rootstocks are more vigorous. So or varieties, and if you don't balance that with, dwarfing or semi-dwarfing on the flip side of it, you have big vegetative spikes and big vegetative lows. And typically the stress period will give you more fruit set, whereas the, growth vigor period will give you a higher, growth, bigger, lower yield. And I think it becomes a very difficult thing to predict. We are notoriously, bad at predicting our crop. It's not like apples or citrus, we have a consistent yield. And because we're not good at predicting, we tend to predict 12 tons and you get 14. Or you think you have an on-year and you say, well, I'm fertilizing for 16 and you end up with 9. And that also induces a lot of variability. So is that the nutrition issue, or is it understanding our crop and how stable our crop is? And that pivots back to, genetic, control. So the simple answer that I can give you is, I think, one, understand the varieties that you work with, understand the combination of those two, and then bring in whatever tools you have. And these 3 things together should, work in harmony, because those variables are interactive. And we have to really, really assume that there's more than one variable that affects alternate bearing.
Thanks, Sandra.
I mean, Sorry, I just want to add, and you have climate on top of that, that influences stress, and then you can't control it.
I would agree with that comment because I've been involved in many rootstock trials. We always have Duke 7. And I think Duke 7 tends to have less alternate bearing, but if you have anything upset the trial in any way, a heat event, a cold event, et cetera, even Duke 7 can have extreme alternate bearing. So
Exactly.
it's a big thing. Does anybody have a question that they want to ask Xander before we close the meeting? If not, we had a question about trellis and we're running out of time. I would say go to the YouTube channel and you can hear Xander talk about trellising of avocados. It's a very, very nice video. It's one of the very first Avocado Cafe sessions. I think it's session number 2. But trellising is really, really interesting. 4 varieties that are adapted to trellis. Maluma, obviously, I think in my belief, Lamb Hass has a similar growth habit to Maluma, so it's a candidate. Luna, the new variety, would be. I'm not so sure about Gem, but I think Gem would be worth trying. Pinkerton, perhaps. But we have very little experience with that in California. I know there are people playing around with it in California, though. So we'll, I'm sure, hear soon about that. But maybe if someone was going into a high density planning and was going to go to trellising, would you pay particular attention to the rootstock, or would you just go ahead and use whatever rootstock you think is, you know, I don't know, what would you use a dwarfing rootstock for a trellis?
Yeah, I'll because I see there's a question about sign rootstock combinations that I like, Maluma Bounty, Maluma Dusa. So I'll combine everything in one. I think again I'm maybe oversimplifying or I'm overemphasizing energy management or energy balance. And there's no better term than let's say what they use in wine in terms of terroir. So really understanding your microclimate, your soil, and all the factors around it, because we often tend to look at things in isolation, but we don't sort of build it in. So in our good red, deep, well drained soils, I would definitely sort of stick with Dusa, and Dusa is the norm. It yields very consistently. We were concerned it's too vigorous. We were thinking Duke 7 will perform better on the trellis because you need low vigor. But on the other side, the benefit of high vigor, and I'm not saying Dusa is vigorous, Bounty, G755, those things are much more vigorous. But it's important to understand that in relation to something like Duke 7 and some semi-dwarfing rootstocks, Dusa is more vigorous. The benefit of that is it kicks in a rejuvenation cycle. So you're yielding extremely well, but you're also rejuvenating very well. And that keeps us away from alternate bearing. And with us, and specifically with trellising, where you're making small cuts to try and optimally yield, you get, it's a very precocious rootstock. So you get very good, shoot maturity very quickly. And, in that sense, I do like precocious rootstocks. I would really encourage people to go to precocious rootstocks. But again, coming back to energy management, you have to understand that if you have a limiting soil, you have a limiting climate, the worst thing that you can do is put in a precocious rootstock and a semi-dwarfing variety. That's stress on top of stress on top of stress. So when you have, let's say, extreme rocky soils like that one picture I showed of Chile, I would probably encourage someone to rather use something like Bounty or a more vigorous rootstock. Some of those slate soils, I think slate is the correct word, that they have in Spain, the very rocky soils. Dwarfing rootstocks on a dwarfing variety is suicide in that scenario. But if you have an extreme vigorous variety such as Hass or Carmen, again, a dwarfing rootstock can have massive benefits even in a limiting environment. So I think the end goal is one, density. but I'm a firm believer in high density, and that's for that reason, you know, even in challenging environments, I would encourage people to try and understand what that energy balance looks like and work towards it. And I would say step one is, you know, growth vigor versus growth vigor, and balance that, you know, so less vigorous, more vigorous, or the other way around. But then, you know, start evaluating the soil conditions, the microclimate, and understand it. And sometimes people even underestimate the effect that something like wind can have. You know, high wind conditions pose a lot of stress on the tree. So even that, take it into account, because if you have to, you know, dwarfing rootstocks, then you really need, or dwarfing rootstock and variety, you really need to go high density and spend a lot of time on, you know, managing the tree, so that you don't lose it. Obviously, it can give you extreme yields, but that needs a hands-on approach. It's not a, you know, 1,000-acre farm that does that.
And one final question we have, because this, we've had it twice, is what is your go-to recommendation for a grafting technique at different growth phases? So I assume this is for grafting in the field.
Yeah, so if it's field grafting, typically, you know, let's say if we talk traditional top working, you know, older stumps, whether that's 3 years old or, you know, 30 years old, what we prefer to do is cut back the tree, sort of somewhere between hip and shoulder height, more towards hip height, and then, you know, you would do bark graft on that. So basically just cleft open the bark and insert your budwood there. But you can have very low success rates on that. So the important thing to remember there is you need thicker bud sticks. You need to think about sort of having your reserves. You get higher success rates with, you know, lateral shoot grafts and things like that, but or side, you know, growth. The main thing to keep into account is you also lose time there. So you have to cut back, wait for the shoot development, and then graft. So what we typically do is do the bark graft. If you have a, you know, somewhere between 50 and 80% graft take success there, you've, you know, gained in time. So then whatever didn't take will go back to, you know, a lateral graft. So yeah, that's typically what we would do there. In terms of graft techniques, I think it's also important to understand, you know, cultivar and rootstock combinations. And to be honest, over 30, 40 years, we've employed different things in the nursery. Sometimes it also has to do with a grafter. Sometimes it's a rootstock cultivar combination. The dwarfing varieties tend to have, you know, a lot thinner budwood. So Maluma, for example, very difficult to do top working with because you struggle to find a lot of thick budwood. So, you know, that also affects your grafting height in the nursery, for example, you know, how much growth you should allow before you start grafting. So again, multi-variables, but I think it's important for each grower or each nurseryman or each grafter to find something that works very well for him specifically, because that's the effect of your hands in the end.
Thanks, Sander. And just before we leave, I want to give a little sales pitch for the Ellis Best Day Symposium. If any of you have been having hunkering to go to South Africa in August of next year, I believe there'll be another Alice Best Day Symposium, and there's usually an International Visitors Day that is organized that I've been to many times. It's a very interesting experience. And then when the symposium's over, you're only 2 hours away from Kruger Park, and you can get saturated with just looking at wild animals for a couple days. So if you've wanted to go to South Africa, that would be a great time of year to go, both to learn about avocados and see how different and similar South Africa is to us, and also to be able to see, it's a good time to go to Kruger Park. So I want to thank you, Xander, very, very much for coming up with the idea for this session, and for taking your time and being so generous with your knowledge and willingness to share information. And I know that Consuelo and you did a wonderful job, and want to thank you very much.
No, I appreciate it. And again, thanks for the opportunity. And yeah, thanks that we all can share this ever passion. I think to me, that's the biggest honor of everything. So yeah, thanks for affording me the time and listening to all the rubbish that I talk. So really appreciate it. And thanks for the extra ad you put in for the symposium. We'll try and obviously advertise it as widely as possible.
Well,
But we'll
we can
soon
send it
release
to
the dates.
yeah, we can send it to the distribution list for this, once you have that.
That would be
So
very
you can
kind.
send that to me, but,
No, and it's open day, so everyone's obviously welcome. But yeah, thanks again. Really, really appreciate it, and especially for your patience and time.
yeah, and thank you to everybody for staying with us for an extra 20 minutes. And we're putting together another session for sometime in January, and Lorena will be sending that notice out hopefully within the next 2 or 3 weeks. So thank you very much, and have a wonderful Thanksgiving holiday for those of you in the United States. Thank you.
Bye, everyone.